My daughter threw party behind my back. What happened to her sister that night changed me forever. Hello, read it. I always believed I had built a safe and loving home for my children. Not in a way that stifled them, not in a way that made them feel trapped, but in the way a mother should, by providing warmth, discipline, and protection. I am Margaret, 42 years old, a mother of 3 daughters, and for years I had dedicated my life to keeping them safe. I thought I was doing everything right. I thought I was raising them to be responsible, to understand the weight of their choices, to know that there were consequences for their actions. I wanted them to grow up to be kind, thoughtful, and wise, to make the right decisions when I wasn't there to guide them. And for a long time, I convinced myself that I had done exactly that. But one night changed everything. One decision shattered the foundation of everything I had built. And it wasn't just my daughter's decision. It was mine too, because I should have seen it coming. If I had been a different kind of mother, maybe things would have turned out differently. Maybe if I had been stricter, less trusting, more suffocating in my discipline, I could have prevented what happened. Or maybe if I had been more lenient, let her make her mistakes earlier when the stakes weren't as high, she would have learned before it was too late. These thoughts haunt me. The what-ifs, the possibilities. Every night, I lie awake and think of all the different choices I could have made, all the moments where I might have stopped this from happening. But the truth is, I did what I thought was best. And I failed. My eldest daughter, Vanessa, was always the difficult one. Not difficult in the way that made you love her any less, but in the way that made parenting feel like an uphill battle every single day. She was headstrong, confident, and utterly convinced that she knew more than I did. And in some ways, maybe she did. She knew how to get what she wanted. She knew how to manipulate people, how to flash that charming smile, and bend the world to her will. It was a gift, but also a curse, because it meant she never truly understood what it meant to hear the word no. She had always been the kind of child who wanted to touch the fire to see if it would burn, and even after getting burned, she still wouldn't regret it. She would laugh it off, move on, and find something else to push against. I should have known she would push against me eventually. I had said no. Over and over again, I had said no. She wanted to throw a party. It started as a small request, an innocent one at first. Just a few friends, she had told me, nothing big. I didn't like the idea, not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't trust the world. And that was something Vanessa had never fully grasped. How dangerous the world could be, how quickly things could spiral out of control. She thought I was overreacting. She thought I was being paranoid. She thought I was holding her back. We had this argument so many times that I lost count. She would come to me, voice dripping with persuasion, talking about how she was almost an adult, how I needed to start trusting her, how it was unfair that she had more restrictions than her friends. I would tell her that my job wasn't to be fair. My job was to keep her safe. It would always end the same way. Her rolling her eyes, storming off, slamming the door. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought she would sulk for a few days and move on, the way she always did. But I underestimated her. I underestimated how much she wanted this, how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. And I overestimated my ability to stop her. The weekend happened. I had gone to visit my sister in the next town over. A short trip, just an overnight stay, nothing I thought I needed to worry about. My husband was away on business, and my middle daughter, Sarah, was staying at a friend's house. That left Vanessa at home with my youngest daughter, Emily, who was only 14 at the time. A quiet girl, a sweet girl, the kind of child who never got into trouble, who never asked for much. She was nothing like Vanessa. She was the kind of daughter who would sit on the couch with me and watch old movies, who would stay up late reading instead of sneaking out, who would rather spend her weekends baking in the kitchen with me than going out with friends. She was soft-spoken, careful, and kind. And that's why I thought she would be safe. But I was wrong, because the moment I left, Vanessa saw her opportunity. She didn't care that I had said no. She didn't care about rules or respect or consequences. She wanted a party, and she was going to have one. So she did. She invited her friends, and her friends invited their friends. And before long, the house was filled with strangers, with people she had never met before, with boys and men who had no business being in my home. I would later learn that the music was so loud the neighbors almost called the police. I would later learn that there was alcohol that someone had even brought drugs, that people had stumbled through my house, drinking, laughing, making messes they wouldn't clean. And somewhere in that chaos, my youngest daughter was there, quiet, unnoticed, lost in the sea of reckless teenagers and strangers. She was just a child, and she had no idea how dangerous that night would become. I didn't know any of this at the time. I didn't know that while I was sleeping at my sister's house, my own home was being torn apart. I didn't know that my daughter had betrayed me in the worst way possible. I didn't know what was coming. Not yet. Not until I returned home the next morning and stepped into a nightmare I could never wake up from. The house was eerily silent when I pulled into the driveway the next morning. At first, I felt relief. Maybe Vanessa had actually listened to me. Maybe the night had been just like any other, quiet and uneventful. But the moment I stepped out of the car, something felt wrong. The air was thick, stale, like the remnants of something heavy still lingered. And then I saw it. A beer bottle tipped over near the front steps. A cigarette, but still fresh, discarded carelessly on the pavement. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. I moved forward, gripping the door handle, pushing it open. The smell hit me first. A thick, nauseating mix of alcohol, sweat, and something sickly sweet, something that didn't belong. The moment my eyes adjusted to the dim light of the house, my breath caught in my throat. The living room was wrecked. The coffee table was knocked over, bottles and red plastic cups scattered across the floor. The couch cushions had been shoved around, some even missing. A dark stain covered the rug, and I had no idea if it was spilled alcohol or something worse. The television was still on, its blue screen flickering, casting an eerie glow over the disaster. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped further inside, my breath shaky. I knew what had happened. I didn't need anyone to tell me. She had done it. She had thrown the party despite my warnings. And now I was standing in the aftermath. I was furious. Furious that she had disrespected me. Furious that she had disobeyed me. Furious that she had turned my home into this disaster. But more than that, I was afraid. Because as I scanned the room, my daughters were nowhere to be seen. Vanessa. My voice was hoarse, dry. No answer. Emily. Silence. I moved quickly, stepping over the mess, heading toward the hallway. The doors to the bedrooms were open, some slightly ajar, others wide open like people had been moving in and out all night. I glanced into Sarah's room, untouched. She hadn't been home. I already knew that. But then I saw my own bedroom door open, and inside, two figures were tangled in my bed, fast asleep, half-dressed. Strangers. I felt sick. My hands clenched in a fist as I forced myself to move forward, to keep looking. Vanessa's room was next. The door was closed, but I could hear movement inside. My anger flared as I pushed it open. She was there, lying on her bed, fully clothed, her makeup smudged, her hair a mess. She stirred slightly when the door creaked, her eyes fluttering open for a moment before she groaned and turned over. Vanessa! My voice cracked through the silence like a whip. She groaned again, pulling a pillow over her face. Ugh, Mom. I stepped inside, my hands shaking. What the hell did you do? She didn't answer right away, just sighed heavily, rubbing her temples like she had the worst hangover of her life. I could smell the alcohol on her from across the room. My chest tightened. The party? Vanessa, what did you do? My voice was trembling now, the anger being swallowed by something deeper, something colder. She blinked at me, sluggish and confused, before her eyes widened slightly like she had just remembered something. That's when I saw it. The flicker of fear, the hesitation. She sat up quickly, wincing at the movement. She swallowed, glancing toward the door like she was looking for an escape. And that's when I knew. Something had gone terribly wrong. Where is Emily? The question came out harsher than I intended, but my patience was gone. The house was wrecked, strangers had slept in my bed, and my youngest daughter was missing. Vanessa hesitated. That moment of silence, that half-second where she looked away, was enough to set my heart into a frenzy. Where is Emily? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper now. I don't know, she mumbled, rubbing her forehead. She was here last night. I didn't wait for her to finish. I turned and stormed down the hall, shoving open Emily's door. And that's when I saw her. She was curled up on her bed, her back to me, wrapped tightly in her blanket despite the morning warmth. At first, relief flooded my chest. She was home, she was safe. But then I noticed the way her shoulders were stiff, the way she didn't react to the noise, didn't stir at the sound of my entrance. Emily, my voice was softer now, trembling. She didn't move. Something was wrong. I moved closer, my breath shallow, my hands trembling as I reached for her shoulder, gently turning her over. That's when I saw her face. Pale, eyes hollow, lips cracked. Her expression was blank, distant, like she wasn't really there. A wave of ice spread through my veins. "Sweetheart," I whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She flinched. The movement was so small, so subtle, but I felt it like a punch to the gut. My Emily, my baby, my quiet, gentle daughter, she was afraid of my touch. And then I saw it. The bruises. Dark, blooming across her arms, her wrist. The red marks against her skin, the small cuts, the way her body tensed even at the slightest movement. My throat closed. I couldn't breathe. Emily finally turned her head toward me, and when our eyes met, I felt my heart shatter. Because I knew. I didn't need her to say anything. I didn't need to ask. I could see it, written all over her face, in the way she refused to meet my gaze, in the way she clutched the blanket to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her together. I had left for one night, and my baby had been hurt in ways I couldn't even comprehend yet. My breath came in short gasps, my vision swimming, the room closing in around me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to shake Vanessa, to demand to know what had happened, to know who had done this, to make them pay. But I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at my little girl, curled up like a wounded animal, and realize that I had failed her in the worst way imaginable. I had told Vanessa no. I had fought, I had argued, I had done everything in my power to stop this. And yet, I had still lost. And now, I had to figure out what to do next. The house felt different now. It wasn't just the physical wreckage, the broken furniture, the discarded bottles, the stains on the carpet that I knew would never fully come out. It was something deeper, something invisible but suffocating. The walls held secrets now. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of something unspeakable. A home was supposed to be a place of safety, of warmth, of comfort. But this house? It had become a crime scene, and I had no idea where to start. Emily still hadn't spoken. Not a word. Not a sound. I had left her room because I couldn't bear to see the empty look in her eyes, but that image followed me everywhere. I had seen my daughter cry before, had seen her hurt, but never like this. This wasn't just sadness. This wasn't just pain. This was something deeper, something that had hollowed her out from the inside. And the worst part? I didn't know what to do. What could I possibly say to make this better? There were no words strong enough to undo what had been done to her. But I could find out who did it. I could make them pay. I forced myself to move, to focus on something. Anything to keep from breaking down. The house was still littered with evidence of the night before, and I had to pick through the mess, hoping to find something, some clue, some proof of who had been here. The phone I had found was just the beginning. I picked it up again, my fingers unsteady as I scrolled through the messages. The words felt like poison, seeping into my skin. These weren't just random teenagers blowing off steam. They knew what had happened. They had talked about it. They had treated it like gossip, like entertainment. I needed names. I needed to know who had been in my house, who had been near Emily, who had looked at her and seen something they could take. I turned to Vanessa's room. The door was still open, the faint smell of alcohol and perfume lingering in the air. She was sitting up now, staring at the wall, her expression unreadable. But I wasn't here for her remorse. I was here for answers. Her phone was on the nightstand. I grabbed it without hesitation, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. Vanessa didn't even try to stop me. Maybe she knew she had no defense. Maybe she knew there was nothing she could say to make this better. The messages were worse than I expected. Her group chats were filled with conversations about the party. People laughing about how wild it had been. Jokes about how they barely remembered the night. Mentions of strangers, names I didn't recognize. Then, buried in the chaos of messages, a comment that made my stomach turn to stone. That girl was out of it. She didn't even fight back. The room spun. My breath caught in my throat. I had to read it again and again and again, hoping that somehow I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. I knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This wasn't a moment of recklessness. This was planned. Or, at the very least, it had been noticed. A joke to them, a passing comment. And my daughter had been the victim. My hands clenched around the phone so tightly I thought I might break it. But the rage wasn't enough to smother the crushing realization that followed. If this was a joke to them, if they were comfortable enough to talk about it, then they weren't afraid. They didn't think anything would happen to them. They didn't think they would be caught. They thought they could walk away from this like nothing had happened. I wouldn't let them. I scrolled further, looking for names for anyone Vanessa had been talking to before the party, during the party. And then I found them. A list of messages sent out before the night began, invitations to people Vanessa barely even knew, people who had no right to be in my home. And in the middle of them, her name stood out. I didn't recognize them. They weren't kids from her school. They weren't from our neighborhood. They were older. My pulse pounded in my ears. I could feel my body trembling, but I couldn't stop. I checked their profiles, their pictures. My blood ran cold. These weren't high school boys. These were men, adults, strangers who had no business being anywhere near my daughters. Vanessa had invited them. I dropped the phone, my entire body shaking. My own daughter had done this. She hadn't meant for it to happen, hadn't planned for Emily to get hurt, but she had opened the door. She had let them in. She had created the perfect storm, and then she had walked away while it raged inside my house. I had never felt such deep, burning rage in my life. But anger wasn't enough. I needed proof. I needed more than just text messages. I needed to know exactly what had happened. I turned to the rest of the house, to the abandoned cups, to the jackets strewn across the floor, to the trash left behind. I found a wallet near the couch, half buried under an empty beer can. I picked it up with shaking fingers, flipping it open. A driver's license. A name I didn't recognize. An age that made my stomach churn. 23. Not a boy. A man. In my house. At Vanessa's party. The same name that had appeared in her messages. I had everything I needed. The phone. The messages. The wallet. The names. I had the proof. Now, I just had to decide what to do with it. The police. That was the obvious answer. The right answer. But something inside me hesitated. A deep, unsettling voice whispered that this wasn't just about justice. This was about revenge. About making them feel the kind of fear my daughter had felt. About making them suffer for what they had done. I had always been a good mother. A responsible woman. A person who believed in doing the right thing. But in that moment, staring at the names of the men who had destroyed my daughter, I wasn't sure if the right thing was enough. I wasn't sure if I wanted justice. Or if I wanted blood. The weight of what I had just discovered pressed down on me like an unbearable force, suffocating, inescapable. My hands trembled as I gripped the wallet, my fingers tightening around the worn leather, as if crushing it could somehow crush the reality of what had happened in my home. I had names. I had proof. I had everything I needed to march into a police station and demand justice. But something inside me held back. Not fear. No, this wasn't fear. This was something darker, something colder, something that had been simmering beneath my skin since the moment I saw the bruises on my daughter's arms. Justice wouldn't be enough. I needed more. I walked through the wreckage of my living room in a daze, stepping over shattered glass and discarded clothing, the echoes of the previous night still lingering in the air like ghosts. The men who had done this had walked out of my house, smug, untouched, convinced they had gotten away with it. The thought made my vision blur with rage. They were out there, living their lives, laughing, drinking, doing whatever they wanted without a single thought about what they had left behind. And Vanessa, my own daughter, had brought them here. Whether she had known what would happen or not didn't matter anymore. She had given them access. She had opened the door. I forced myself to breathe, to think. The police. That was what I was supposed to do. That was what any normal mother would do. I should have been calling them right now, giving them names, evidence, telling them to track those monsters down. But the idea of putting my faith in a system that failed women every single day made me hesitate. How many times had I seen stories about cases like this being dismissed? How many times had I watched mothers weep on the news because their daughter's rapist had walked free? I couldn't take that risk. No, I wouldn't leave this in someone else's hands. I would handle it myself. I took the wallet and the phone and went back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I sat on the bed, my thoughts unraveling into something dark and determined. I opened Vanessa's phone again, scrolling through the messages, finding the names, the profiles. I memorized their faces, their locations, where they worked, where they lived. Social media made it so easy to track people, to find their routines, their habits. These men were careless. They had no idea that someone like me was watching. One of them, David, worked in a mechanic shop on the other side of town. Another, Eric, was a bartender at a club I had never heard of. The third, Mason, seemed to have no job at all, just a string of pictures of himself drinking, partying, showing off. And the last one, Tyler, was the one who terrified me the most. His pictures were the kind that made my skin crawl. Guns, money, a lifestyle I knew was steeped in crime. He wasn't just some careless man at a party. He was dangerous, and he had been in my house. I stared at his face for a long time, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Revenge was a foreign concept to me, something I had only seen in movies, something that didn't belong in the real world. But my world had changed. My reality had shifted, and I wasn't the same woman I had been before last night. I had to make a choice. I could go to the police, hand over the evidence, and pray that justice would be served. Or I could do what no one else would do for my daughter. I could make sure they never hurt another girl again. My hand was steady now, my decision made. I wasn't going to the police. I was going to them. The first one was easy. David. He was predictable, careless. His workplace had his hours posted online, and I knew exactly when he'd be leaving. I parked across the street from the shop, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had never done anything like this before, had never even considered taking justice into my own hands. But sitting there, watching him laugh with his coworkers, completely unaware of the destruction he had left behind, something inside me hardened. I stepped out of the car, my heart pounding, but my mind sharp. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 1,000 times. I walked straight up to him, my face blank, my voice calm. He barely had time to react before I held up his wallet. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by something else, fear. He knew. He knew why I was here. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply told him that I knew everything, that I had his name, his address, his entire life in my hands. And if he didn't want me to ruin it, if he didn't want me to burn his entire world to the ground, he would give me the names of the others. Not just their names, but their truths. Who they were, what they had done before, what they had planned. David broke easily. He wasn't the ringleader, just a follower, a coward who had gone along with something he knew was wrong because he was too weak to stop it. He spilled everything, and what I learned made my blood run cold. This wasn't the first time. Emily wasn't their first victim. They had done this before. They had done this to other girls at other parties, in other houses where people had trusted them, and they had always gone away with it. Until now, I left David there, shaken and pale, knowing he would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. I didn't need to hurt him. His own fear would do that for me. But the others? The ones who had orchestrated it? The ones who had led it, encouraged it, taken pleasure in it? They wouldn't get off so easily. I was going after them next, and I wasn't planning on being merciful. The woman I used to be, the mother who kissed scraped knees, who packed school lunches, who believed the world was at its core fair, died the moment I saw the bruises on my daughter's body. I'd spent my life protecting my children, and in one night, I had failed in a way I would never forgive myself for. But I would not fail again. Justice wasn't enough. Justice was a word people threw around when they had faith in the system, when they believed that rules and consequences applied to everyone equally. But I knew better. The world was not fair. These men had done this before. They had hurt other girls. The system had let them go once. I wouldn't make that mistake. I spent the next 2 days unraveling their lives. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I moved like a ghost through my own house, watching over Emily, keeping Vanessa under my glare, making sure my husband didn't sense what was boiling inside me. I told him Emily was sick. I told him Vanessa had thrown a party and things had gotten out of control. I didn't tell him the truth. Not yet. He wouldn't understand. He would try to stop me. David had been easy. The next 3 wouldn't be. I started with Mason. He had no job, no responsibilities, no purpose beyond drinking and partying. He was reckless and arrogant, flaunting his lifestyle online, bragging about things no decent man would be proud of. But he was also predictable. He liked the same bar, the same streets, the same patterns. He didn't realize he was being followed. He didn't notice the car trailing behind him as he stumbled out of a club, laughing into his phone. He didn't notice the way I watched him, waiting for the right moment. When he turned down an empty street, I made my move. I pulled up beside him, rolled down my window, and spoke his name. He stopped, confused, squinting at me through the haze of his intoxication. Then he recognized me. I saw it in the way his face changed, the slow realization creeping into his expression, the way his body stiffened. I let him sit in that fear for a moment before I spoke. I told him I knew what he had done. I told him I had evidence. I told him that if he thought I was going to the police, he was wrong, because what I had planned for him was far worse. He ran. I let him. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to. He would never sleep soundly again. I had planted the seed of terror in his mind, and it would rot him from the inside out. He would never be sure when I would strike, how I would come for him. And when he finally turned himself into the police, blubbering about a vengeful woman who knew too much, they wouldn't believe him. He had no proof. But I did. 2 down. 2 to go. Eric was next. The bartender. The smooth talker. The one who had been laughing in the messages, making jokes about my daughter like she was nothing more than a story to be told and forgotten. He wasn't a coward like David, and he wasn't reckless like Mason. He was smart, calculated. He would be harder to shake. So I didn't shake him. I destroyed him. I sent his messages to his boss, his coworkers, his family. I dug into his history, uncovered every ugly thing he had ever done, every skeleton he had ever buried. I put it all out in the open. The bar fired him within hours. His landlord evicted him the next day. His own mother refused to answer his calls. By the end of the week, he was nothing. 3 down. 1 left. Tyler. The worst of them. The one who terrified even the others. The one with pictures of guns and cash and a lifestyle that had already left bodies in its wake. He was dangerous. He was violent. And he wasn't afraid of people like me. But he should have been. I found him at night, standing outside his apartment, smoking a cigarette, his eyes scanning the streets like he was always expecting something to go wrong. He wasn't careless like the others. He was prepared for war. But I didn't come to fight. I came to end it. I stepped into the streetlight, and he saw me. He didn't react at first, just exhaled a slow stream of smoke, watching me. I could see the gears turning in his head. He thought I was here to beg, to plead, to threaten. I did none of those things. I smiled, and then I told him everything. I told him I had spoken to the others. I told him I knew every detail of what had happened in my house. I told him that David had turned into a paranoid wreck, that Mason was running like a hunted animal, that Eric had lost everything. I told him that I wasn't calling the police, that I wasn't interested in the law, that I was interested in something far more permanent. And then I showed him the gun. I had never held one before that night. I had never even thought about it. But in that moment, with the weight of it in my hands, with Tyler's eyes locked onto mine, I knew I was in control. He had expected fear. He had expected anger. He hadn't expected certainty. I told him to leave. Not just the city, not just the state, but everything. His life, his identity, his existence. I told him that if I ever saw him again, if I ever heard his name, if I ever even felt his presence near my family, I would do what the law wouldn't. And he believed me, because he had seen what I had done to the others, because he knew that a mother with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous thing in the world, because for the first time in his life, someone had made him feel powerless. He left that night. I don't know where he went. I don't care. What mattered was that he was gone. The next morning, I sat by Emily's bed, brushing her hair from her face as she slept. The bruises were fading, slowly, painfully, but she still hadn't spoken. Not to me, not to anyone. She was still trapped inside the nightmare. and I didn't know how to bring her back. But I would be here when she was ready. I would wait. Vanessa had packed her things. She had tried to apologize, but I didn't want to hear it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She was leaving for college soon, and for once, I was grateful. I didn't know if our relationship could ever be repaired. I spent 15 years building my family, creating a home, raising daughters I thought I knew. And in one night, it had all fallen apart. But I had done what I had to do. And if I had to do it again, I wouldn't change a thing.